know, as student advocates, you're accustomed to speaking very loudly with a loud voice. So let me know if you can't hear me, and I'll let you know if I can't hear you. This will be somewhat interactive, especially as I attempt to understand more about the work that you're doing and also imparting some of my experiences about the work that I've done. Thank you again for having me. I'm very pleased to be with you today at your conference, and I was asked to speak about closing the equity gaps in college completion. And so as we think about that, I'm going to give you probably a different lens through which to think about how we close equity gaps and what our roles are in terms of the way that we examine equity, how we think about equity, and how we apply a self-examination to the process of looking at equity. And so I'm going to talk in general about, though, diversity, equity, and inclusion are three words that we often hear utilized interchangeably when we're talking about. You can't hear? Sorry. Working on it, okay. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are three words that typically are used pretty interchangeably, not just in the higher ed space, but in most spaces where we're talking about having other voices at the table and including other people. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time attempting to define the terms, but I'd like to know what comes to mind when you hear the word diversity. So you can shout out some terms. Do you think about difference? Do you think about other? What types of words come to mind? Any of those? Representation. Background. Blending. So when you hear some of these words, what do you feel when you consider the concept of closing completion gaps through an equitable lens? Do you think about inclusiveness? Do you think about giving somebody a leg up, or one person gaining and somebody else losing? Because sometimes I know as you think about how we're going to meet the completion challenge in terms of post-secondary education, education always seems to have a winner and a loser. And so we're thinking more about how do we make sure that there's a win-win for everyone. But I would also offer that there's a win-win for you in doing this work in terms of how we engage. Typically, conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion are focused on other people's needs to have their voices heard. That's the perception. Or how they can be included or at the table, or they can be given additional supports to be on equal par with others who, for whatever reason, are already ahead of the game. However, if always viewed through the lens of how to accommodate other people's wants, needs, and desires, that can lead us to experience what I've often heard from my colleagues who work as student advocates as having DEI fatigue, or diversity, equity, and inclusion fatigue. There seems to be lots of talk about diversity, talk about equity, talk about inclusion, and they're trying to figure out, when is this fad going to pass? When are we going to be through this whole conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And while few would likely openly admit to having DEI fatigue, it can be a real thing because it requires a lot of work. Working to challenge ourselves and our long-held notions and belief systems, working to challenge the status quo in our work environments and the way we've always done things, and working to educate others who would rather languish in ignorance than to emerge consciously into self-awareness and enlightenment. So when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion as a reference to others and their wants, their needs, and their desires, or their frustrations or their complaints, that's more of a negative, deficit-based thinking of diversity, equity, and inclusion. When somebody feels like DEI is a nuisance or a burden that their dean or their chair of their department is forcing them to insert into the curriculum, is forcing them to incorporate into their advising techniques. And everything is for someone else and nothing is for you. And especially when you have competing pressures of attempting to increase enrollment, increase persistence rates and graduation rates, getting to the point where your work is completely selfless, seamless, and natural takes time, especially because traditionally, institutions have been allowed to operate the way they've always operated without having to adapt to the needs of the students they serve. And that's the difference that CCA, the Complete College America, thinks. We're less about trying to fix the student and more about trying to fix the institutions and structures that receive students and that support students. So as we think about what's in it for us, and none of us is exempt from this, because as you think about Abraham Maslow and those of you who have studied education theory, you know he has a hierarchy of needs. And he says that really our highest self is trying to get to transcendence, right? But that the first basic need is about how to take care of myself. And so when you think about this, is that aligned with diversity, equity, and inclusion? especially when you're talking about protected classes, people of difference, people of different orientations. I would actually extend the notion to say that equity and inclusion manifests itself in higher education in terms of how we respond to these groups. And it's directly correlated with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And although it's typically framed, again, within these levels of hierarchy, we're all trying to get to that sixth level of hierarchy, which is transcendence. As student success advocates within institutions in urban, suburban, and rural geographies across the state where you're helping to support students of highly diversified ancestry, diversified belief systems, economic circumstances, issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion take on particular prominence. As you operate within the Hoosier higher education landscape in your experiences as a student advocate, you are operating in an educational environment where, first of all, Indiana ranks 40th nationally in higher education attainment and 41st in personal per capita income. So you have to also attend to that. You're operating in an environment where less than a third of Indiana's four-year college students graduate on time and just over half graduate after 6 years. And I'm sure you can put a name and a face on each of these statistics, right? You're operating in an environment where only 4% of the state's two-year college students complete on time and 12% graduate within 3 years. You're operating in a landscape where only 1 in 4 Indiana college students enrolled in remedial courses will earn a degree within 6 years. But here's the good news. That landscape is actually where it's right for there to be equitable outcomes and equitable inputs for these students. And you're also not alone. I'm sure most of you know these national statistics where 10% of youth from the lowest income quartile, only 10% right now are estimated to graduate from college versus 80% of youth in the highest income quartile. But this data point reminds me that while one of the biggest problems we have in education is socioeconomic, not academic, what's a bigger barrier for students to complete college than the socioeconomic conditions of our students is the way we treat students of difference, the way we treat students who are first in their families to attend college, the way we treat and support students who are Pell eligible. Are we treating them in a way that otherizes them as opposed to provides equitable outcomes for them and is inclusive to their circumstances? And when I say we, I mean the universal we, the faculty, the administrators, the staff, support systems, but also structures. So when we talk at CHC Complete College America about the various interventions that we want to have on behalf of students, we're always thinking about not looking at that student as if they're defective or they have a problem, but instead looking at our structures and institutions and saying we're defective and we might have a problem and being able to look reflexively. The ways in which we allocate financial resources, scholarships, grants, et cetera, that has an equity lens to it. The way we deploy well-qualified human resources who are equipped to advise and support students are the best people supporting students and giving them academic and financial information in terms of helping them to persist. Low-income, first-generation, and returning adult students and their families are battling so many other issues that academics sometimes is unfortunately relegated to the bottom of their priority list. And it's not because of their lack of capability, but because of the maintenance of structural barriers which inadvertently keep students in college too long rather than helping them to complete college. The result, of course, usually results in somebody stopping out or dropping out. And are we thinking about the systems? Are we thinking about whether there are gatekeepers to students completing college or whether or not there are pathways for students to be successful? So that's the way we have to think about the way we're advising students, the way we're supporting them, and how do we get to a yes? In the distant past, and I say distant past because I know you all are reformers and have changed the landscape around this, but in prior years, it was all about telling a student how to fit their round life into the square peg of an institution. And so if you have a child and you're a single mom, if you're a returning adult and you have a full-time job, you were made to shift the way you think and the way you behave into our time frames in higher education and to our structures. And if we still are doing those things, this is where you come in. We have to be impatient reformers about the way the institutions view students and not view them as someone who is the other coming into our sacrosanct institution, but instead looking at how we revise our policies and procedures to get the student to a yes. The data related to student completion or the lack thereof are not necessarily interpreted in a way that we should be shifting higher education and become more equitable entities, where blame is placed on students who, in my experience, when I was an academic dean, I had lots of valedictorians and salutatorians who would test squarely into developmental math and reading. And so they were already on a remedial track, and yet we said that student is defective, they don't have what it takes, and they're not college material. How do we redefine what a college-ready student is? And how do we support them in ways that leverages the financial assistance that they're going to be receiving, also leverages their time to degree, so that we respect the student's time and understand that they're trying to get out with that credential or that degree so that they can then become very successful in terms of their earnings. We have to think about that differently, as opposed to saying to them, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, learn better, have more money, and then you can complete college. And as CCA founder Stan Jones would really say, time, structure, and choice are really the enemy of those higher educational environments becoming more equitable. And if we focus our efforts on making sure students have structured time in terms of engagement to complete college, limited choice so that we help them be more nimble in terms of their course selection or their major selection, but also structure, that we're looking at being malleable and nimble in terms of our institutional structures so we can help students to be successful. The state of Indiana, for example, has developed its Reaching Higher, Achieving More challenge, whereby it's seeking to increase on-time completion rates for Indiana students to at least 50% on four-year campuses and 25% at two-year campuses by 2018. So you have about 3 more weeks to go to get those goals accomplished. Indiana is also saying it wants to double the number of college degrees and certificates produced currently by 2025, which would basically mean an annual increase in degree production from 60,000 to 120,000 degrees, and increasing higher education attainment of Hoosier adults to 60% by 2025. So you have these mandates by the state, you have the mandates by your institution, you're also now having to think about all the different types of the diversity that exists on your campus and make sure you're looking at all of these goals and outcomes with equity in mind. It can be overwhelming, it can be daunting. Under these circumstances and with all of the attendant pressure, how in the world can you fit in any awareness, observance, or actions which contribute to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts? And why should you, when it's seemingly all about accommodating and benefit someone else, why should you put your efforts into this? What's in it for you? And when will you be able to fit all of this in your limited day of 8 hours in order to change the landscape when we continue to see a losing proposition where students are stopping out and dropping out of college? It poses a different challenge. How are you going to fit it all in, and how are you going to do it? And the good news in my message today is, first of all, don't worry about diversity because it's not going anywhere. So we have to be focused on it because it's not going anywhere, but it's not a fad that's going to pass. It's something that we're going to have to be attendant to at all times. These are now our lived realities. So it's not a fad to talk about diversity. It's not a fad to talk about equity or inclusion. This is the new reality. So I think the good part about this, especially as we look at the landscape of where not just higher education is going, but the country is going in terms of diversity, these issues, the things we do today will impact us for the long haul in terms of completion. So I think as opposed to looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion as discrete, separate projects that are happening autonomously outside of us, realizing that this is really our new reality, that's the first thing. So how do we reframe then the concept of equity to fit within a win-win proposition where it's, will I ever win, to yes, we can all win together. And again, it oftentimes feels like a losing proposition, but I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how you can make it work for you. First, I believe it's important to recognize that your very opportunity to serve students who are, by virtue of where you have elected to serve, they are naturally diverse, right? Every student is different. Just like if you have children, every one of your children is different and responds differently. So by virtue of your choice of this work in post-secondary education, you have chosen to be within diversity. As a matter of fact, higher education tends to be where most people who have been sequestered in their communities tend to meet people of difference for the first time, right? So there's an opportunity for all of us in terms of operating within this landscape to have a win-win proposition. Second, when you bypass all of the many geographic, academic, social, and emotional issues that typically inhibit the equitable treatment of students compared to their more privileged counterparts, I encourage you to look at your students, not only as students, but as people with diverse experiences. They have unique pathways for how they got there. They have varied support systems. They have different religions and beliefs from you. And I'd encourage you to learn more about them and leverage their experiences to make your experience in this work and your institution a richer, more asset-based learning environment where everybody wins. So whether your students are native to Indiana, whether they're transplants, whether they identify as LGBTQ, from that community, whether they hail from a low-income family, You must see your students uniquely, not simply through the lens of their difficult circumstance or the otherization of them. You must truly see them with the same precision and intentionality that you who are faculty, when you differentiate your instruction for your students, you have to think about the way you differentiate your supports for students the same way. The advisement that you provide to students cannot be cookie cutter, even if you're trying to get them to the same goal. So 2 econ majors will not necessarily have the same level of conversation with you in terms of level of motivation, attendant financial supports, and those sorts of things. Really think about your students as individuals. And then bring your unique background to your students, and this will create a tasty gumbo, which when blended together, it will align all of the individual unique flavors to enhance the whole. And so this is the second aspect of the win-win proposition, because typically people think of being different as only being if you're a minority, if you're low income. You actually, no matter what your situation or station in life is, you're bringing your diverse background and experience to the conversation. Even if it's a story about how you succeeded in college or how you didn't succeed in college, that narrative also helps. So using qualitative data about the students' credits earned and the credits accumulated and what they will need to graduate, but also bringing diverse conversations about your background to the conversation. And third, this is really a continuation of the second idea, but in order to experience a win-win as it relates to equity, we must reframe our thinking to not think of other people as other, to a more self-focused, reflexive, strengths-based, and asset-based version of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That means you need to think about DEI starting with yourself. This approach requires some true recalibration about the notion. It's less about other and it's more about you and how you perceive other people, how you perceive people's circumstances, how you treat and interact with people who you would ordinarily call other and thinking of yourself as other. Basically, you take other out of the central analysis and put yourself in the middle of the conversation. And I like this approach because it casts us as the central character in our own diversity, equity, and inclusion story. Here's what I mean. Start by asking yourselves questions like, why am I here at this institution at this unique point in time, serving these particular types of students? How did I get here? And I could be anywhere else in the world. How did I get here? And obviously, why am I serving here? Because you're here at this conference, you're working in your various institutions. Obviously, you're committed to this work. Why? That's a strengths-based assessment, because that's the first part that's different about you, that you bring to the table beyond your academic credentials. You bring a passion and a fire in your belly about this work. So think about what motivated you. Think about that student who you helped move from point A to point Z sometimes, and you can always remember their story and keep that in your lapel so that you always have something to check back to and say, I'm doing it for John. I'm doing it for Martha. I'm doing it for Jose. I'm doing it for these particular students. And let that be the battery in your pack and your back when you're sometimes feeling like, I can't do this anymore. Here's another question. What other assets can I bring to the table? Do I bring a knowledge of other languages? Am I willing to learn a language in order to interact with my students? So if you have a predominantly Latino student body, are you willing to learn Spanish or other languages or learn about their culture in order to engage? And then ask yourself, why or how does my addition of my unique, diverse sets of experiences, talents, gifts, ideas, and viewpoints, and how, if I include them in my conversations or my support of students, how am I helping them to be successful? Are you ashamed to tell your story about how you dropped out of high school and how you had to enroll in an associate's degree program and you dropped out there too? And then it took someone after you worked for 20 years and you went back to college. Have you told that story to a student? Because sometimes we have those stories as shameful, and they shouldn't be. That really could be the reason why you're here, to connect and inspire another student. That will give you the win-win, because it will also tell you that your ability to serve in this way is going to help not only meet your personal and professional goals and dreams, but it's going to also help to meet the aspirations of some of your students who will be inspired by you. Are you treating your student as if they're the only person that matters in the world when you're speaking with them? Are you valuing them, or are you dehumanizing them? Are you inadvertently making statements that could make them feel less than? And so think about the way you like to be talked to and the way you like to be treated and the way that you can engage with students on a personal level using your personal story. And then think about what attracted you and what keeps you coming back semester after semester, month after month, day after day, and year after year. And realize that right now, you're already experiencing the win-win of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it keeps you coming back. The person who is self-transcendent, as Maslow's theory acknowledges, recognize that despite all of the challenges that I've already discussed and all of the analysis of why you should endure these challenges, that the service you render daily, annually, and throughout your career ultimately is not about you. People who engage in student advocate work are like those in the social service or social work field. This is a helper field. We're trying to help students not just to be enrolled in college and to be successful while they're there, but we ultimately can't wait to go to that graduation and see that student succeed. Miriam Wright Edelman, president and founder of the Children's Defense Fund, once said that service is the rent we pay for being. It is the very purpose of our lives and not something you do in your spare time. So with that being said, I submit to you that your meta motivation for all that you're doing really is about self-transcendence, going beyond yourself and focusing on others, whether it's the student, whether it's our community, or whether it's the world. And we know that each of these students will turn out to be somebody that we never imagined they could be. They'll do wonderful things, they'll create cures we never saw, and that you had some small part or large part in that happening. So self-transcendence should really be the genesis of the motivation you have to continue to do this work. To learn more about the cultures of your students, to learn more about their religions, to understand why they're wearing certain garb and to have respect for that, and then to pass it on. As you learn more, when you hear someone make a statement that's insensitive or is not very enlightened, that you can also educate other people about what's happening on your particular campus and the students that you've worked with. This is what diversity, equity, and inclusion looks like on the ground. Transcending such that you decrease the focus on yourself and your career and your job, and increase the focus on the unique needs, attributes, and life stories of your students' lives. You don't stand in judgment or in indifference or space from them. You actually stand alongside them on the journey in terms of them completing college. I know that trying to see what your students see can be very difficult. With so many students to work with and all of the many needs that they bring to the table and the diverse assets they bring to the table, but I believe all of you is up to the task in this room. Helping to mold the minds and motivate young people in Indiana, but that's also why you're here at this convening, seeking tips and tools and facts and best practices and strategies and success stories, connections to people of like mindset, around state policies and initiatives impacting the field on how to close the equity gap in higher education. You're here because you want to know, but you're also here because you have a story to tell, and you've done it before. You've made gains. You've made, whether they were interim gains or whether they were large gains, you've done something that's moved the needle. Are you sharing that story? Are you coalescing with others who are not from your institution and talking about what you did? And are you also looking at what you're doing at your institution and attempting to extrapolate it across the entire university and scale? Each of you here is to be applauded for being innovative, collaborative, opportunistic, nimble, and strategic in the ways in which you approach the challenges of supporting, advising, and sometimes even teaching the most historically underrepresented students of your institution. You are to be commended for the ways in which you have transcended your most basic needs on Maslow's hierarchy and have jumped in headfirst going for it to help Indiana students to reach their fullest potential. But as you focus on this upcoming semester and those beyond, be energized not only by the diversity you see in your set of advisees or on your campus writ large, but by the diversity that you also add to the educational gumbo. Be inspired by the equity for which you advocate by virtue of your profession. The work that you're doing is focused on equity. We are serving the least and sometimes the last, and many times the lost. We are serving students that have the but-for proposition, but for some intervention on behalf of some success stakeholder, but for a scholarship or a grant that helped them to go to college, but for the 21st Century Scholar Program, but for somebody who said you can do it when everybody said college isn't for you. So we're dealing with the but-for students. So you are already ensconced in equity, and so taking all of that in from a positive asset-based way of thinking is going to make it very powerful for you. Diversity with its many definitions is all around us. As I said, it's not going anywhere, it's here to stay. As a matter of fact, even in historically some of the most monolithic, non-diverse places, diversity has not only broken through, but has become ubiquitous. But equity is a choice. We must choose to be equitable in our thinking, in our assessment of situations, in our distribution of resources, and in the fair treatment of students. Equitable behavior means we give the most to those who need it the most, and not that we're picking sides or choosing favorites, but we use data to guide those assessments, to figure out who needs the most help, If you think about a student, if you have one student who's 6 feet tall and one student who's 4 feet tall, only one needs a step to see over the fence, right? So making sure that we're not thinking, oh, equitable outcomes or equitable work means giving everybody a small piece and dividing it equally. You've already disadvantaged this person by letting this other person who has had the 2 feet advantage for all of their lives now be able to see higher over the fence as well if you give both of them a step, right? So that's not what we're talking about. Equity says, oh, I'm looking at the data and I can measure you. I know you're only 4 feet tall. You need a step to look over that wall, right? So that's where we use data in order to inform equitable outcomes and decisions. But also, think outside of the box and try new things, which will elucidate and support the unique and diverse textures of your academic environment. Look beyond the obvious dichotomies of black, white, or brown, female, or male to understand equity at its most impactful level. Push yourself to go further to herald diverse perspectives and experiences and to celebrate them during obvious and not so obvious moments. Use your unique situation of constantly experiencing, facilitating, and perpetuating diversity amongst your students or advisees. With equity and inclusion being tenacious, you should be fiery, you should be a fiery advocate and proponent of all that these students have on their behalf. It's really nothing more than wanting these students to succeed and being unapologetic about that. It's being unapologetic about the types of students you serve, how they benefit, and that you are indefatigable in the way that you will support them toward their completion goals, right? And especially in the context of our Indiana mandates around college completion. Indiana students are likely receiving one message from student advocates like you who promote the value proposition of not only a college degree, but credentials of value. And that message is that you can do it, and I'm here with you along the way. The organization I lead now, Complete College America, advocates for game-changing strategies to force institutions and higher educational systems to look reflexively at the ways in which they welcome or do not welcome, support or do not support the students who need the most help in college. Our work is to get all 50 states, and right now we have 46 states that are a part of our alliance, but our work is to get all 50 states nationally and the post-secondary institutions within those states to advise students to enroll in 30 hours during their freshman year. We also want them to eliminate gatekeeper algebra courses and create math pathways. Eliminate remedial and developmental courses and replace them with co-requisite support, where students can be immediately entered into college-level courses, save money where they're not using their financial aid on courses that don't bear any credit. And we also want to tie students' purpose with their course selection and their major selection, and really think about how we can create meta majors as opposed to discrete finite majors. These are the things that the Complete College America has been doing now for 10 years, and this will be our 10-year anniversary next year. We have lots of success stories. We have lots of models. So when you hear about 15 to finish or enrolling in 30 credit hours, you may say, oh God, I don't know if we can do that. But we have leaders and exemplars who've done it in different contexts, and we can show where it can work in all sorts of institutions, whether they're regional, whether they're urban, whether they're suburban. We have exemplars. And so part of what we also do is to provide support, technical support, to help you do this on your particular campus. So progress is happening on this and many other fronts. And whether you're staying late to confer with or tutor students, having personal conversations with students and their families, purchasing materials and resources from your own money and your own pockets, and I know we've all done that, sometimes foregoing time with your own family in order to help someone else's child be successful in college. And many times that child does not look like you, does not believe in the same greater power as you. They don't share any of your common experiences, but you're doing it because, again, you love that student and you want to see him or her succeed. And you see the power and the capability in them, and you see possibility in them. And so what we sell in this work is hope. We're here to tell students, I am hopeful for you, and there is hope for you to complete. And then we galvanize all of the resources to help them see it. So sometimes we go from helping them to visualize it to then actually corralling the resources to help them really see it. So it's not just in their mind's eye. They can see tangible things that are there to help them. That's what transcendence is about. It's no longer about us. It's about these students. You've demonstrated in word and deed that you are committed to education, and more specifically, equity and educational outcomes like college completion. Because you're here, you've demonstrated it. Because you've done the work, you've demonstrated it. And you're gearing up to return to your institution next semester focused on equity and college completion, because we've got a graduation deadline coming up right this year, right? But slain civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy." The population we serve it's a lot easier for us to serve the highest quartile of students economically, right? Where do we stand in times of challenge and controversy? When people are going to tell you you could make a lot more at another job, when people are going to tell you those students are not going to make it, where do you stand? And we have to stand flat-footed alongside these students to let others know also the work we're doing is worth it, and it is not just about the private benefit for that student. This is a public good that we're giving hope for in terms of post-secondary education so that we all benefit. These are indeed sometimes very uncomfortable, inconvenient, challenging, and controversial times, especially when you're looking at institutions that sometimes don't align their dollars toward the equitable outcomes we're seeking to find. But you have to be stalwart and ensure a more educated and less impoverished citizenry, because there is no separation between generational poverty and educational outcomes. And so we're doing more than just making sure a student has an education. We're making sure that we're eradicating poverty on a more holistic level. But you're going to reach all of the student success goals that we've talked about today, and even those more discrete goals that you have in your departments. You're up to the task. You've transcended from being about you or about your promotion or about your job or about your career or your resume or your vita. And you have been prepared for such a time as this, when diversity, equity, and inclusion are under attack. You must make equity central to the achievement of the Indiana Reaching Higher, Achieving More goal. You must ask questions that center on equity, even when no one else will. You must move from inserting the word equity into all of your current scorecards and your performance evaluations and your assessments and your marketing materials, just updating them with the inclusion of words, and move to the action of equity. Making sure your hiring faculty, staff, and administrators is equitable. Are we looking at hiring through an equity lens? That your promotion processes operate with equity in mind. This is what institutions must do in order to meet the equity agenda. Institutions must also make sure that campus spaces and student organizational resources are distributed equitably. Is your course schedule equitable in its design and implementation such that diverse students, such as returning adults who work or have childcare needs, that they can access the courses they need on demand and in real time in response to student schedules? Make sure that you're constantly creating and asking questions about how your institution and the curriculum of the various majors and faculty, how are they faring on issues of equity? What are we doing intentionally around equity? What have we changed about our instructional design? What have we changed about our supports for students that says we are a part of an equity agenda and we have things more than just what we say in a brochure, and it's really something that we're doing in terms of action? Do you disaggregate the data? Show it back to your superiors. Do you show them where we're falling short? Are you taking note of the fact that if you just say males, that you're not looking at males of color? And then you say males of color, which males of color? And then are we looking at American born? Are we looking at those who have come from other places? How are we disaggregating the data to tell the true story? Because a lot of times it's a lot easier to keep everything at a very high 30,000-foot level to make ourselves look good. But are the most disadvantaged students being served when we do that? And sometimes we get complacent talking about equity, as I mentioned, having DEI fatigue. How do we instead move from the margins to the center of the conversation about equity? And how can you move the needle on that? I believe you can do it. I believe you will do it because the students, their families, their communities, and the state of Indiana are worth it. And although you may not know all there is to know about diversity, equity, or inclusion, first I would advise you to learn as much as you can. Read voraciously, talk to colleagues, take in as much information as you can, again, so that you can think reflexively about DEI. Again, I believe you're going to reach your goals because you demonstrate the win-win value proposition of diversity, equity, and inclusion, where students win, you win, and the institution wins. And that's the firm foundational basis for commitment to DEI. But I'd also say this. You're going to win because you're in the arena. And you've heard this quote by Theodore Roosevelt, but I think it's worth repeating. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds? Who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions? Who spends himself in a worthy cause? Who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Why? Because they never entered the arena. So I applaud and laud each and every one of you, and I simply honor your commitment to staying in the arena, because you're the ones Indiana students have been waiting for. Go forth and continue to support and advocate on behalf of these diverse students in inclusive and equitable environments, like your future depends on it, because in all actuality, it does. Thank you very much. Thank you.